Hi, everyone, and welcome to this last day and the last few sessions of SAM 21. It's great to see a few familiar faces on here as well. My name is Harsha Sule. I'm the Residency Director and Associate Director of Global Health at Rutgers NGMS in Newark, New Jersey. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, which is Dr. Manpreet Singh, who comes to us from out west at Harbor UCLA Medical Center. He is going to share with us a video and will introduce himself as well in the process, so I'm not going to do the longer introduction. After the video, there'll be a chance for question Q&A as well, and given the generally smaller groups, we can just unmute ourselves and ask the questions, or you can post in the chat as well. With that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Singh.
All right, thanks, Arsh. I'm going to share our video with our team, who's also on here, Abbas Hussain, Zach Rapinchak, and Jay Cadby. We'll be introducing ourselves through here, but give me 1 second while I figure out sharing this video. Hopefully I didn't. Here we go. And let me know if any problems with the video audio.
So welcome everyone to SAM 2021, our talk on getting promoted, digital scholarship and the promotion and tenure process. Today,
Dr. Singh, it seems as if your video and audio are frozen.
I'm core faculty at the Oshner Emergency.
Say again, guys?
After the initial
your video and
intro, we
audio are
lost.
frozen temporarily. I think we might be back though.
All right, let me try that again. Here you go. I'm going to put it from the beginning again, guys. Sorry about that.
Okay.
So welcome everyone to SAM 2021, our talk on getting promoted, digital scholarship and the promotion and tenure process. Today, our session will focus on how to practically do this. So what does digital scholarship mean? How to include it in your CV, and how to identify and capture the digital scholarship that you're already doing. So it will end with a Q&A session, so stay tuned through to the end. So just to introduce ourselves, I'm Emily Brumfield. I'm core faculty at the Oshner Emergency Medicine program in New Orleans, and I was the senior author on the paper that we're going to be discussing throughout this session.
Hi, everyone. I'm Abbas Hussain. I'm one of the Associate Program Directors at Staten Island University Hospital.
Hi, I'm Jay Cadby. I'm the Associate Residence Director at the University of Florida, Jacksonville.
Hey, I'm Zach Rapinchak. I'm Associate Program Director, Temple Emergency Medicine in Philadelphia.
Hi, everyone. I'm Manny Singh. I'm the Clerkship Director at Harbor UCLA Medical Center in Torrance, California.
Let me take you back to 2019, Seattle, Washington, the Cord Academic Assembly. This group of highly intellectual people, colleagues in our specialty got together on a consensus conference. And the purpose of this conference was to define some best practices for the use of digital scholarship in the promotion and tenure process. So we had a great meeting, came up with a lot of great ideas. And what came out of that meeting was this manuscript, the Consensus Guidelines for Digital Scholarship and Academic Promotion. So we'd like to share this QR code that will give you direct access to that paper. So you'll have it, so you can use it as a complementary piece to our talk here today and keep it in your file. So with that, I'm gonna throw things over to Abbas.
Thanks, Zach. So first, let's talk a little bit about the P&T process, just to kind of define it for everybody. Each institution has its own unique process. It's important early on in your career to get familiar with it and identify specifically the CV format that they use and use that to start building out your own CV. I like to keep mine on my desktop and update it weekly with the information that I've changed. In addition, I also recommend having a folder where you store your supporting documents for an educator's portfolio. Here you would keep course evaluations, documents of your invited speakerships, etc. The process is arduous. Mine took about 18 months, and each step can be painful. Consider outsourcing the CV formatting if you have a lot of documentation, i.e. for a medical scribe or TaskRabbit. And as you go through the process, something we learned is that there's not even a category or acknowledgement of digital scholarship in many of the P&T committee's rubric. So it's important for us to recognize that it's in our best interest to make our activities fit into their rubric. In the next section, We will further define digital scholarship and how and where to include it in your CV. The P&T committee's focus is often on work that's clearly demonstrate your impact on learners in the field of EM. For example, innovations in teaching, curriculum, and course development. For example, you're an EPD and you've educated 10 classes of residents with an impact on 100 learners in your tenure, or you've been a mentor to several chief residents. Next, you're going to assemble your letter writers. Something that's helpful for them is to draft a summary of your relationship with them and how they can best advocate for you. So I'm going to now turn it over to Emily to talk a little bit more about some of the details here.
Thank you. So first, we need to define digital scholarship. The reason we selected this term to describe what we do is we felt it best described the multiple ways that one could contribute academically in the kind of non-print or non-traditional space. It includes digital forms of traditional scholarship, like a blog discussion of an article that exists both in print and in digital media, essentially the digital sphere of the water cooler, as well as novel educational methods that traditional scientific journals are not necessarily the most appropriate venue to disseminate. And certainly of any year, this has been the year for novel educational methods involving the digital space. So we hope you've all been writing down what you've been doing. The reason we felt this work was needed is, as a couple of other folks have already mentioned, we feel like promotion and tenure processes don't traditionally reward or recognize the work that goes into digital scholarship. And so we wanted to create that niche within your P&T process and to give it value. So sadly, for some, digital scholarship does not mean every single thing that you tweet, having a snappy social media persona or a blog where you rant about the problematic healthcare system. It has to meet the same academic criteria, of course, as any other scholarship. And we do review in the paper the underlying theory behind what constitutes scholarship. We won't be going over that here, but know that there is a foundation and it informs our work. So the most important things are that where the intersection of impact and quality meet, you have to demonstrate that with your digital scholarship. And so, of course, you want to note that as well as your role within that digital scholarship. And I'll go over these individually. So the impact part is probably one of the easier ways to measure or note on your digital scholarship, because we already are familiar with a lot of those metrics in the sense that we use page views, time spent on page, geographic reach of our academic efforts, and dissemination like shares or RTs. While you might not think that those are necessarily important things to know, if you have a really viral tweetorial that engenders a lot of discussion online, that's an educational example of digital scholarship. There are more sophisticated measures of reach and impact that we've kind of shown on the side here, like the altmetrics score, the Alexa index, and other like an altmetrics that you may need to have a footnote explaining in your portfolio what exactly they mean, because a number of 61 may mean nothing to your P&T committee, but you need to explain why that's good or bad for that particular piece of scholarship. And then one of the things that's perhaps more important in digital scholarship is your role. Since there are a lot of novel educational methods within digital scholarship, you will need to explain to the P&T committee exactly what your role was, like editor, podcast host, or guest, things like that, because that won't be intuitive in the same way that we all have a kind of common understanding of like author order in a traditional piece of scholarship. Not only is it important to not take credit for work that you haven't done, but it's also to explain the myriad ways that you are involved in education within the digital space, that you're attempting to educate your target audience, your target demographic in a multifaceted way. And then finally, we'll look at quality. Just like regular scholarship, this is the hardest thing to demonstrate. Thankfully, many of our colleagues have been working on ways to measure this, like the Academic Life in Emergency Medicine AIR score, the metric 5, 8, and R metric scores, and they help us demonstrate quality. Again, for the more traditional P&T committees, they won't know what the LEM AIR score is or the metric score is, so you'll have to explain that. It also is important to explain if you're part of an online discussion that involves peer review, you may need to demonstrate that. So now we will go on to Zach to explain more.
All right, thanks, Emily. So I want to talk a little bit more about how exactly we can identify and capture that digital scholarship that Emily just talked about. And I'm going to give this to you in a 3-step program. So step one is identifying the things that you've already done. You may have already contributed to the world of digital scholarship and not even realized it yet. So perhaps you wrote a blog post that maybe you forgot about. Maybe you appeared on a colleague's podcast. Even some social media posts, as Emily mentioned, can have educational value, tutorials, infographics, some sort of educational Instagram story. So there may be these things that you've already done that you identify that you do, and that it counts as digital scholarship. Another thing to think about is sometimes lectures that you're given that you gave somewhere are then repurposed as online educational content. A great example of this, AEM has a lecture of the month. So a lecture that someone gave at a scientific assembly gets produced and becomes part of AEM's online platform. So again, you can get extra credit from something that you did, a lecture you gave, as being digital scholarship on top of the in-person lecture that you gave. So I think the first thing you should do to kind of do this first step of identifying what you've already done is just Google yourself. Put your name a couple different ways, your nickname, your full name, in a Google browser and see what comes up. And you may find that there was something that you completely forgot you did, and make sure that you're not missing anything. So let's move to step two. So step two is looking for more opportunities to contribute in this digital space. And there's a lot of educational websites, a lot of blogs out there who are looking for contributors. So if there's an educational blog that you follow that you get a lot of satisfaction, a lot of educational value out of, approach the person who leads that blog and ask if you can be a contributor. These places are frequently looking for contributors, and it's something that you could do. You may have a blog or a YouTube channel at your institution or your residency. So find out if you do, and if you do, contribute to that. Cord has a blog, the Vocal Cord, always looking for contributors. There's also the Cord Connect series, which you probably get emails from on a regular basis. These are all forms of digital scholarship that you can do through our organization of Cord. And certainly you can create your own educational videos, videotape your lectures, create your own YouTube page. There's lots of things that you can do. More and more people are also leveraging social media. So, Instagram Reels and, even TikTok is a place people are recognizing as a place that it's okay to create educational content, and people are coming onto these platforms looking for educational content. So just be creative. If you like to draw, if you can create graphics, audio recording, video recording, be creative. Just at the end, assure that it has educational value and it meets these three criteria. First of all, that's public, easy. All digital scholarship is going to be public by definition. It's going to be out there in the world where people can see it. Number two, it needs to be available for peer review and critique. This is one of the great things about digital scholarship is unlike print scholarship that takes a while for peer review to happen and takes a while to get, the letters to the editor, feedback. When things are put in the digital space, you get peer review and you get critique from the academic community almost immediately. So it's definitely good for that. And finally, reproducible and extendable, things that you create in the digital space, other people will see, they'll be inspired by, they'll run with it. So if it meets those three criteria, it counts as digital scholarship. And that brings us to step three. Normalize digital scholarship. And what I mean by that is put these things on your CV. When you find these things you've done, when you Googled yourself, when you find these new opportunities, be proud of them and get credit for them. P&T communities may not be fully on board with all these things yet, but the more they see them show up on CVs, the more they see them in teaching portfolios, the more they appear in promotion packets, the more they'll become used to them and the more likely they will to value them. Now, exactly how do these things appear on our CV and our promotional packets? Well, I'll throw it over to Jay for that one.
All right, thanks, Zach. So in this last section, we're going to talk about how you actually can practically take your digital scholarship and put it onto your CV as part of your P&T packet. So in your CV, you're going to have a section where you're going to put all your scholarly bibliography, right? All the items that you did, your published articles, everything. And somewhere in there, you want to include your digital scholarship. So this is kind of an example. It's going to vary the order of how you put this in your CV based on your institution. But you're going to start off with your peer-reviewed original research articles, and then from down there, you're going to go kind of in decreasing importance or impact. And somewhere in there, maybe after proceedings and non-referee papers, you're going to include digital scholarship. And this is how kind of we recommend you doing that and including it there. So how you can actually cite your digital scholarship items, again, is going to be dependent on your institution's requirements. But in general, we're going to recommend defaulting to the AMA manual of style. And that's what we talked about in our paper. Now, when we published our paper last year, the latest edition of the AMA manual style was from 2007. And so they didn't give a whole lot of guidance on how to incorporate digital scholarship and social media publications. but the manual style was actually updated last year to the 11th edition. And so they've now started to include how to cite blog posts, how to cite podcasts, things like that. And so it's a lot more helpful. And so I've updated a little bit about our recommendations for how to cite your digital scholarship based off of these new AMA recommendations. So a general citation format that you can use for digital scholarship is as follows. So last name, first initial, then the title of your submission. So if it's a blog post, what was the title of your blog post? Or if it was a podcast episode, what was the episode title? Followed by the publisher. So the name of the blog or the name of the podcast. Then the date that the item was published. Then the date it was accessed last. So that's the date you're going to update it, making sure it's still accessible online. And then finally, include the URL as a hyperlink at the end. So that's kind of being the general format. You're going to adapt that to your different forms of digital scholarship. Now, before your last name, you might want to consider adding qualifiers and brackets. So this would be to specify what the type of digital scholarship it was. So if it was a blog post, was it a peer-reviewed digital scholarship? Was it a video? Things like that. And you can also include your role on that scholarship. So were you the podcast guest? Were you the blog post author? Things like that. And that'll give more detail about what that digital scholarship item was and how you participated in its creation. Next up, Manny's going to talk about a little bit, give you some examples of how that's actually going to look like on your CV.
So we're briefly going to talk about a little bit examples, as Jay mentioned, of your digital scholarship and the qualifiers that are commonly used. So going to the first example that we have here, if I'm on the P&T committee, I'm actually reviewing this bibliography, I can see that this is a blog post by Mike Gasandi on leadership in medical education addressing sexual harassment in science and medicine. That's published in the International Clinical Educators blog on this specific date. Is accessed on this date with a specific URL. Alternatively, if you have a podcast, you can put the podcast guest down, who was done by, what the podcast is about, the date it was published, and when it was accessed. I think one thing you can do to actually take your citations to the next level is by adding metrics onto it. And when we talk about metrics, the reason why we want to add metrics actually shows the impact of your digital scholarship and its value to the P&T committee. So it's very important that whenever you put something online, maybe a blog post, a podcast, that you actually ask for this data, give it a certain amount of time. And then again, every time you're re-updating your CV, you go back and ask for new metrics. And this can be how many times you actually blog post with, how many page views you had on it. If you had a podcast, how many times it's downloaded or actually listened to. And if available, you can ask for things such as the altmetric score. Tweets is another great thing to ask, because you actually see how many times your specific blog post or digital scholarship was actually tweeted out, how many impressions it had overall, and what the impact of that was. And if available, you can definitely do the metric and air score to look for the quality assessment. So here's an example of a post that was done by Brent Thoma and Teresa Chen, as well as Javier Benitez and Michelle Lin, talking about how many times they're, if you look at the actual impact of this post, you can see they had 4,137 page views. The all-metric score is 61. Just tweeted 202 times from 86 users and had an impression of 263,000. That shows a lot of impact when a P&T is actually reviewing this. Handing this back to Emily to conclude this.
Yeah, so we're going to give you guys another second to take a look at this QR code if you have not already, just so you can look at the paper. There's more examples in there and of course, more background. It's a little bit longer than this topic, than this session. So if you have any questions or other areas that you would like help in, we're here to ask.
Great, thank you for that. I know we have most of the co-presenters, co-authors on this as well. So if anyone has any questions they want to shout out. So I'm going to start off with a quick question for any one of you, which is that as you did the prep and the research for this paper, were you able to get a sense for how other specialties also may have addressed this topic of digital scholarship? And the reason I ask is when you look at promotions, tenure committees, they're made up of a mix of specialties. And I'm wondering if we're at the cutting and the leading edge of this, as we often are, or is there some traction from other specialties and departments as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think very much so we're on the cutting edge of this. I think we've kind of saw this as a place to emergency medicine to kind of take the lead. I think a future direction for this will be involvement of other specialties, and I think it will, have its most impact and if we can get other specialties on board. But so far, I do believe emergency medicine is definitely leading the way, as you mentioned.
I think it'll be important for as many of us that are able to get on these promotion and tenure committees, not just for digital scholarship itself, but in general, overall, physicians are underrepresented in professorships and associate professorships. So, urging everyone I can, I've applied to be on our promotion tenure committee as much as we can to continue that push forward. A couple of specialties that do come to mind are urology and nephrology. They've been really popular, at least in the Northeast, and getting on social media.
There's a question in the chat that says, should you put metrics if they aren't so amazing? Podcasts with 100 versus 500 versus 10,000 listens. My answer to that would be, yes, you should. Your listenership will grow slowly over time. So if your initial podcast wasn't viewed that much, it's going to slowly add up. And we've seen that, I provide a lot of the metrics for the blog that I run, emdocs.net. And, initially they have maybe a couple hundred, and over time it gets to the thousands, and definitely disseminates as it gets more percolated through social media.
Yeah, there's definitely articles people publish that only a handful of people read them. And so, I mean, showing any impact that you're reaching people and that people are learning from you is important. So I wouldn't worry so much about the numbers and what the exact numbers are, but just make sure that you're listing them.
Great. Any other last questions? We're at time, so I'm going to give a second there. Okay, well, thank you to all of you for the presentation. That was great. I sit on our institution's promotions and tenure committee, so I'll be looking for those metrics and everything else now as well. So thank you all. Appreciate it.